Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel and today I'm going to be doing my monthly reading wrap-up for the month of June 2026. So I've got a lot to talk about because I read 7 books in the month of June, or completed 7 books in the month of June, and I really enjoyed all of them. So I'm probably going to have quite a bit to say about many of these books. So let's get going, shall we? Hopefully you will not hear any big booms or anything during this video, but I am filming it on July 3rd, and unfortunately fireworks are legal in my town on July 3rd and 4th. So people tend to go a little crazy with the fireworks, and probably will be even more crazy this year than usual for the obvious 250th reasons. But we will soldier on and try to get this video done before I have to go and do my 4th of July stuff. So let us begin. As I said, I finished 7 books in the month of June, which is great. I'm basically back on pace after my slumpy couple of months. I feel comfortable with this pace. My usual, normal, comfortable pace of reading is 5 to 8 books per month. So I'm right comfortably in that space again with the month of June. So that is very pleasing to me. I am very happy about that. That makes me feel much more comfortable with where I'm at in my reading. And I'm hoping that I will be able to continue this pace, for the rest of the year and onwards. So, as I said, I have a lot of books to talk about. So let's get started. And if there's a glare on my glasses, it's because I have my laptop here so that I can make sure that I'm not missing anything and that I'm talking about everything that I want to talk about. So, yes, in the month of June, I completed the Winter Night trilogy by Katherine Arden. So I read The Girl in the Tower, which is the sequel to The Bear and the Nightingale. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a great follow-up to The Bear and the Nightingale. This book brings Vasya to Moscow and the court of the Grand Prince, where she's spends a large part of this book pretending to be a boy. And because that's the only way that she can get access to these spaces, right? That's the only way. And this book gets much more political. I can understand why, if you really liked The Bear and the Nightingale and the very atmospheric fairy tale vibe of that book and the very magical, mystical nature of that book, why this book might not vibe with you as much. But I really like the political stuff as well as the fairy tale stuff. And so I was very into this. I was very into the conflict that is being discussed between the Rus and the Muscovites and the Tatars, right? These horsemen, the Khans, the Mongols, whatever you want to call them. That conflict is a very interesting one. I don't know a whole lot about it because it's not really a part of European history that I have studied a whole lot, but I do think it's really fascinating. And I think that Katherine Arden, this is Katherine Arden's wheelhouse, very much her wheelhouse, and she knows a lot about it. And she does a really good job of not only sort of explaining it, but also bringing in those magical elements to make it still very magical, even while it is also very political. And I especially enjoy the ongoing clash between the Christian side of Rus and Muscovy and the pagan side of it. That is very fascinating to me. So there's multiple layers of conflict going on in this book, which I really enjoyed. Plus the family drama of Vasia pretending to be a boy and sort of forcing her brother and her sister to participate in this lie that she is perpetrating against the Grand Prince, who is also their cousin and who trusts her brother very, very much. He's very close in the Grand Prince's confidence, and so this is very much a betrayal. And also her brother is also a monk, and so like he's very conflicted about this, right? He's very conflicted about what he's being forced to do by his sister right now, and that's all very interesting too. So Katherine Arden does a really good job of weaving all of that together with, of course, her very beautiful, lush prose that is wonderful and it's easy to sink yourself into it because it's so lovely and atmospheric and it flows so well. So that was The Girl in the Tower, and then of course I finished the trilogy by reading The Winter of the Witch, and this really does bring everything to a very satisfying conclusion. Again, the mix of the history and the folklore and fairy tales is just exactly what I like, and if anything, I think The Winter of the Witch does it the best of the three books in terms of, again, there's politics and the historical realities of the geopolitical conflict that's going on in this time period, and also there's a strong magical element, and Vasia is really coming into her own in terms of her powers and her abilities, and she's finding out more about where she comes from and why and how she has the abilities that she has, and that is very fascinating and very interesting. And once again, you know, Arden's prose is lush and beautiful, and the descriptions of the places that she goes, such as Midnight, are wonderful, and the relationship between Vasia and the Winter King continues to be very interesting and fun. So I really overall enjoyed the Winter Night trilogy quite a bit, and I may do a standalone video discussing the entire series in a little more depth at some point soon. We'll see how my schedule looks going forward, but I did want to talk a little bit about those books and sort of wrap up that. And then because I had finished that trilogy, Kismet intervened, and my library hold on Katherine Arden's latest book, The Unicorn Hunters, came in just as I was wrapping up the Winter Night trilogy, and so I managed to read 3 Katherine Arden books in 1 month. So yes, The Unicorn Hunters is yet another historical fantasy from Katherine Arden. That seems to be her niche, is historical fantasy, which is great. I've also read her standalone historical fantasy novel, The Warm Hands of Ghosts, which is set during World War I in Europe, in the European front. And that was also a wonderful book that I really enjoyed. It was one of my top books of, I think it was 2024 is when it came out. It was one of my favorite books of 2024. So The Unicorn Hunters is set in the Duchy of Brittany, which is in France, right? At the time that this is set, Brittany was not yet technically part of the French kingdom, but the King of France was trying to annex it. And Brittany at this time was led by a woman called Anne. Anne of Brittany. She's a very fascinating historical figure. What Katherine Arden does with her story in this novel is basically gives it a very magical twist and does a little rewrite with some assistance from Breton folklore, which is really fascinating. The Bretons are basically Celts, so there's a lot of similarities between like Breton folklore and like Irish and Scottish folklore because it has a sort of a similar source to it. They're Celtic. So you have these creatures that are basically what we would know as fairies. They call them something, they have a different word in the Breton language, but they're basically these fairies or elves that you can, they exist in another world, and the human world can kind of interact with this other world sometimes in certain ways. And yeah, it brings an interesting facet. Again, I think The Unicorn Hunters is largely just Katherine Arden, once again, bringing the interesting historical details and contexts and geopolitical situation of a particular point in time and place, and bringing in that magical folkloric fairy tale element and using it to weave a really interesting kind of fable about a person who is a real historical figure, but we're fictionalizing her, and we're going to maybe give her a different ending than what she got in real life. And her character work is great. All of Arden's characters are very well rounded and very three-dimensional. They feel very real, very they're all flawed, they all have their quirks, and it's very easy to get emotionally invested in them, and the world building and the lush prose are excellent. So again, Katherine Arden is just like, she's always a hit for me because she's always working in a register that appeals to me, which is that combination of history and fairy tale and folklore that is just really is a lot of things that I really like all combined together. So that is my 3 Katherine Arden books for the month of June. My cat has decided to join us, so here she is. You get to hear her making commentary on the books as well this month, apparently. Another series that I finished in the month of June was the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. I read Crossroads of Ravens, which is the newest prequel book in the Witcher series that was released last fall. And this book is quite good. I enjoyed it a lot. If you're not aware, this book is the earliest prequel chronologically in the entire series. This follows Geralt when he's about 20 years old. He's basically fresh out of Cormorant on his first sort of expedition outside of Cormorant as a proper Witcher after his training is finished. So he's very young, and he still has a lot to learn about the world, and he meets some characters who teach him a lot about the world, both intentionally and unintentionally. And he learns what the price of revenge can be, and that sometimes maybe the price of revenge is worth it, but sometimes it's not. And I don't want to go into too much more detail about it. This is, like many of Andrzej Sapkowski's books, it's a little bit disjointed. The plot is, I would say, not the main part of this book, right? It's not the most important part of this book. It does have a plot, but it's pretty basic, and mostly what it's about is examining Geralt's character and the way that his character is shaped in these early, as a very young man. And that is, in my opinion, the most interesting part of this book, right? Is seeing how Geralt's character is developed when he's so young. So yeah, this was a really enjoyable read. I would say that there is a good drinking game for this book, which is to take a shot every time a character points out that Geralt is, in fact, very young for a Witcher. Because it happens a whole lot. I will also say that if you are a really big fan, and I'm a really big fan of the relationship dynamics between Geralt and Ciri, Geralt and Yennefer, Geralt and Dandelion. None of those characters are in this, and you're not going to get that from this book. What you are going to get is, again, is sort of Geralt figuring out what kind of Witcher he's going to be, right? Which I think is really, really interesting, right? It's very much about how Geralt becomes the Witcher he is by the time we get to, like, even the short stories and, of course, the main novels in the series. So that is, in itself, I think, very, very interesting, and it was very much worth the read for me. And, of course, Sapkowski's writing, I really enjoy his writing. I always have a good time with it. I think he's often very funny and wry, and has a very dry sense of humor, which I love. So I really like that about it. I always really enjoy reading Sapkowski's writing. So that's Crossroads of Ravens, the most recent book in the Witcher series. So this series now is, I've read all the Witcher books that have been published thus far. So that is a caught up series for me. So that's great. I'm very glad about that. Also in the month of June, I did a reread of one of my favorite books of all time. And that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. There was a readathon in June called Jane in June, or June Eyre, or something like that, hosted by Steve Donahue and another booktuber. I'll put Hannah, I believe. I'll put their YouTube video, their YouTube channels in the description of this video. If you want to check them out, they're both great booktubers, and I highly recommend their channels. But yeah, Jane Eyre, published in 1847, I believe, written by Charlotte Bronte. This is the classic story of a young woman who is an orphan, and she is very unloved, and she's desperate to find a home and a place for herself in the world. She's sent to a boarding school. She spends some time at the school. She eventually decides to leave the school and hires herself out as a governess to the ward of a mysterious older wealthy gentleman, Mr. Rochester, with whom she falls in love, and some gothic creepy things happen, and we go from there. Jane Eyre is, I've said many times on this channel, so unless you're new here, you probably have already heard me say that Jane Eyre is one of my favorite books of all time. I first read it when I was about 13 years old, and I've reread it many times since. I love this story, mostly, I think, because of Jane herself. Jane is narrating her own story. This is very much a Bildungsroman, which is a sort of coming-of-age novel. Jane is telling us her story from a certain distance of time. We don't know exactly how, far in the future Jane is telling her own story, but she is telling her own story from a certain distance of time, and she's often commentating on her own experiences and perceptions, and she is a wonderful narrator, and she's a fascinating character. I really appreciate how much thought Charlotte Bronte put into the character of Jane. She's perfectly willing to explain her own faults and her own follies, and we see by progress through the story, we see the ways in which Jane grows and changes, and how she learns to be the person she is. And I've always found Jane to be particularly, I suppose, admirable character in some ways, simply because she is a woman of deep convictions, and she refuses to compromise any of those convictions, even for her own personal happiness. She refuses to compromise herself. She has a certain set of beliefs about the world, and she is strong-willed enough to hold to those beliefs. And I just really appreciate that about a character. I appreciate that about people in real life, people who have strong convictions and who genuinely try to abide by them. That's just something that I tend to find admirable. Another thing that I noticed when I was rereading this novel is Charlotte Bronte's prose is just absolutely beautiful. I love the way that she describes the landscapes and the weather. She's so good at drawing you a picture of a scene and making it feel like you're really there and you're really seeing these things. It's a wonderful descriptive kind of prose, and it was so fun to reread this and experience it again. Every time I read this book, I get something else out of it, and it makes me very, very happy to read it. So that is what I have to say about Jane Eyre. I also read a nonfiction book in the month of June. It's called How to Build a Haunted House, The History of a Cultural Obsession by Caitlin Blackwell Baines. And this is a very interesting book written by an art historian who is particularly interested in the ways in which the haunted house story has become so ubiquitous in the English-speaking world and how it has come to be so. So this book is not primarily a book of ghost stories or a book of stories about haunted houses. What this book is kind of a cultural history of the haunted house as a concept. And she does this through case studies of specific, quote-unquote, real-life haunted houses. Another thing this book is not is an attempt to either prove or disprove the existence of ghosts, right? She is not interested in, like, making a determination of whether any of the haunted houses that she talks about are, like, actually haunted by actual ghosts. That's not her concern either. Again, her concern is really with the ways in which these stories have developed over time and how they've become so culturally significant and tapped into the cultural zeitgeist of the English-speaking world. So she's really interested in that. And her case studies, I think, are really interesting, and she explores different facets of the haunted house idea through these case studies. So, for instance, she has a chapter on the Myrtles Plantation, which is a plantation house in the southern United States, which was built in the antebellum period, and she uses this story and this home and this place as a springboard to talk about the ways in which ghost stories and stories about haunted houses, and particularly haunted plantation houses in the South, have evolved as we have begun to confront our bloody history of slavery, right? To talk about how we in some ways can use these haunted house stories and these ghost stories to either elide the real history of slavery or to in some ways confront it and actually in some ways deal with the history of slavery and the brutality of it and the atrocities committed on these plantations, right? So that's one chapter, right? She does another chapter on Hampton Court and its connection to famous historical figures and the ways in which we connect with stories about famous historical figures, right? So it's basically celebrity hauntings is the angle she's taking with Hampton Court, right? It's the idea that Anne Boleyn might be wandering the halls of Hampton Court or, 8 other places that she supposedly haunts, right? That's the sort of cultural thing that she's trying to tap into in that chapter. She uses the Winchester Mystery House as a way to explicate the way that society treats women of a certain age and a certain situation in life, right? Where Mary Winchester was a widow and childless, and she was independently wealthy. She had a lot of money, and she did not act according to society's standards, and so society had to create this legend around her to try to explain her quote-unquote strange behavior, even though really what she was doing, she was just living her life the way that she wanted to, and she had the means to do it, but society cannot accept that, and so we have created this legend around her, making her into the crazy woman who was haunted by ghosts and has to build her house constantly to escape them or whatever. So that's the kind of thing that she's doing in this book, and I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was a great read. She's a very good writer, and she brings a lot of expertise and historical detail to the stories that she's telling and the explorations that she's having. She's also visited most of the places that she talks about in the book, so it's very well researched, and she's talked to a number of people, interviewed people involved, who have connections to these homes, and just sort of exploring where these stories are coming from and why they are so deeply embedded in our psyche in the Western world. So that was a really interesting read. I enjoyed it a lot. And the final book that I want to talk about in this video is The Traitor Borrow Cormorant by Seth Dickinson. So I picked this book up randomly at the library because it was there and I wanted to pick up another book. And I had a really great time with this. This is an excellent, excellent book. I have a really hard time describing its genre because it's definitely a secondary world story, but I don't know that I would call it fantasy. There is little, if any, magic in it. There's not really any magic in it. But I'm not sure I would call it science fiction either in the way that science fiction is broadly understood. Storygraph lists it as both fantasy and science fiction, so maybe. But the basic premise of The Traitor Borrow Cormorant is that our main character, Borrow, is a girl who's raised in a particular culture, and then this empire comes and takes over the island that she grew up on and sort of swallows it up over time. It does this not through brute military conquest, but primarily through economic means and also through educational means. They open up a bunch of schools, and Borrow is brought to one of these schools. They're basically residential schools. And Borrow and these other children are all sort of indoctrinated into the knowledge and cultural mores of the empire. Though they do also commit violence, just not in a super obvious or direct way. But it's a colonialism story, right? And Baru, as a child, decides that she is going to destroy the Empire from the inside. So she's a savant, and she's being educated in the ways of the Empire to become an Imperial agent. And so she is determined that she is going to rise through the ranks and become powerful enough within the Empire in order to destroy it so that she can save her home. And this is going to entail a lot of bad things, right? She's going to have to do many very bad things in order to convince the Empire that she is really one of theirs. And that is probably the most that I'm going to say about the plot of the Traitor Baru Cormorant, because A, the plot gets very complicated and twisty, and B, it gets so twisty that, like, you kind of want to just read it and see where the plot takes you, because it is a very twisty plot. There's a couple of plot twists in the book that are very interesting and very surprising, and I don't want to spoil them for anybody. So there's, you know, it's very political. There's lots of spy games happening all the time. Everyone is double or triple crossing everybody else all the time, and you're never quite sure where anyone's loyalties lie. Sometimes we're not even sure where Baru's loyalties lie. The one thing that you can always be sure of, however, is that everything Baru does is with the ultimate goal of destroying the Empire and freeing her people from it. I really enjoyed my time with this book. Seth Dickinson's writing is amazing. It's really, really good. And Baru is a fascinating character, and the themes explored in this book are so nuanced and have so many facets to them, and the questions that this book raises about how to do resistance and how to fight against a tyrannical, oppressive system are so relevant and so necessary to ask ourselves in our current day and age that it just resonated with me on a really deep level, and I felt it was absolutely fascinating, right? To what extent do you have to compromise your own integrity in order to serve a greater end, an end that you think is a greater good, right? To what extent do you have to dirty your hands and get blood on your hands, potentially, in order to overthrow an oppressive regime? And, you know, is there any, you know, can a revolution be nonviolent? I think Seth Dickinson would say no, probably not. There's always going to be a cost, right? There are always going to be innocent victims of such a struggle. And this book is really wrestling with those questions and does not provide any easy answers to any of them, right? Which I think is really one of the things that I like about it the most, is how it is allowing itself to be so ambivalent about all of the things that are happening in the story, right? And Baru herself is incredibly ambivalent about everything that she's doing. She doesn't like the person that she's become in order to do this. It's not necessarily going to stop her from trying to do it, but she is wrestling with herself and her choices through the entirety of this book, and it's an absolutely fascinating read. So I really, really, really loved that one. I gave it 5 stars because it was kind of a standout book for me. So yeah, that was The Traitor Baru Cormorant. So that's 7 books. That's the 7 books that I have watched so far, that I have read in the month of June. My goodness, my brain is all over the place today. I am currently reading 2 books that have carried over. The first is King Sorrow by Joe Hill. I started reading this. I'm reading it on my Kindle, and I'm loving it so far. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. Absolutely cannot get enough of this book. It's great. And I can't wait to see where it goes. I'll be very much looking forward to talking about it in a future video. And the other book I'm reading right now is The Monster Bar of Cormorant by Seth Dickinson. This is the sequel to The Traitor Bar of Cormorant. So this is the follow-up to that, and if anything, I would say this is shaping up to be even better than the first one in terms of the themes that it's exploring and things like that. Again, I'm about 2/3 of the way through this one as well, and I'm loving it. I'm really into this trilogy. I think there might be a 4th one coming at some point, but right now it's 3 books. So yeah, that's what I'm reading right now. I'll be starting Mansfield Park very soon. I'll probably be starting another nonfiction book very soon. So I'm, at least right now, on track to have another great reading month in the month of July. But so that's my June reading wrap up for June 2026. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books, if any of them sound good to you. What have you been reading in June? What are your plans for July? Let's talk about it. If you like what you see, hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.